So welcome everyone. This is a local action for a fossil-free New York. I'd like to welcome all of our distinguished participants today, and thank you for joining. My name is Dominic Frangillo. I'm a former council member and deputy town supervisor in the town of Caroline, New York, and along with Tompkins County Legislature former Chair Martha Robertson, co-founded Elected Officials to Protect New York. EOPNY was launched in 2012 with a letter to Governor Cuomo expressing concerns of local elected officials around the state on fracking and the impact on our communities, and garnered over 850 signatories from every county in New York State at every level of local government to continue the moratorium on fracking. And with the success of the movement for a ban on fracking, which was finalized last week, congratulations to everyone who worked together to help make that possible. EOPNY's focus has expanded from protecting New York from fracking to transitioning communities to and our state to clean energy. And given the developments on state legislation that we'll talk about later that will enable New York to be a leader on both clean energy but also transitioning away from fossil fuels, we work together with the Mayor's Innovation Project to host this educational webinar for elected officials and staff about this emerging topic. I'd like to thank very quickly our promotional partners, Climate Smart Communities Program from New York State, Local Progress, ICLEI, Local Governments for Sustainability, and many more, and of course our co-host, Mayor's Innovation Project. I'd like to now hand it over to Satya Rhodes Conway, former alderperson in the city of Madison, 12th District, and Managing Director of the Mayor's Innovation Project from the Center of Wisconsin Strategy, and in Ithaca, New York, native. Satya, thank you, and the floor is yours.
Thank you, Dominic. And I want to say I'm immensely proud of my home state for getting its act together on fracking, and really appreciative to everybody who worked on that. It was just really gratifying to watch as a New York native from my new home in Wisconsin. Let me say a little bit about the Mayor's Innovation Project. We're a national learning network for mayors and their senior staff, focused on the high road of equity, sustainability, and democracy. We do welcome local governments of all sizes and shapes. We generally interact with mayors, but also city managers and high-level staff, department level or mayor's office staff as well. And you'll see our contact information at the end of the presentation, but I want to take a moment right now to invite all of your jurisdictions to our summer meeting, which is August 13th through 15th in Des Moines, Iowa. Among other things, we'll be talking about sustainability metrics and how to use them to forward the sustainability work that you're doing in your municipalities. So if you are a mayor or senior staff, or if you think your mayor should be interested in these things, please don't hesitate to look us up and know that you're invited to join us in Des Moines in August. Let me take a few minutes on logistics. All of the attendees on the call are muted, but if you have a question as we go along, please don't hesitate to type it into the question box via the webinar software, and we can either address those as we go or save them for the end as appropriate. When we get to questions at the end of the webinar, if you want to actually ask one over the phone, there is a way that you can raise your hand, which lets us know that you want to speak, and then we can unmute you and you'll be able to ask your question. Of course, if you have any technical trouble at any point, you can also type into the question box, and our staff can try and troubleshoot that for you. I think that's it on logistics. I want to just say again, thanks to elected officials to Protect New York. I think this is a great opportunity, and always love to partner with folks to bring good information to municipalities. I'm going to introduce now Mike McGinn, the former mayor of Seattle, who I know mostly because of his leading work on fossil fuel divestment. He made quite an impression on us here at the Mayor's Innovation Project when he took the lead on that. He was also a member of our National Steering Committee for the Mayor's Innovation Project. And in his time in office as mayor, I think really took a number of incredibly progressive actions for his city and became, Seattle has, I think, always been a national leader in a number of ways, particularly around sustainability. But Mayor McGinn really pushed it over the top in a lot of ways, and we certainly appreciate his work while he was in office and his continuing work around issues of climate and fossil fuel divestment now that he's no longer in office. So I'm delighted to have you here, Mayor McGinn, former Mayor McGinn, and I'll hand it over to you.
Thanks, and thanks for setting this up, and I'll do my best to not just share some thoughts, but also try to keep it moving along so we get out of here on schedule and respect everybody's time. Oh, look at that, and there's a picture of me. Why don't we move to the next slide already? I can barely stand to look at myself sometimes. So in addition to being mayor of Seattle from 2010 to 2013, I'm also a New York native. I grew up on Long Island, found my way out here to law school when I was 29 years old. And I actually was really deeply involved in climate issues as a volunteer activist in the city of Seattle. And I'm just going to tell a brief story about, kind of what I've seen as the arc of the climate movement over the last decade or so, where it's heading now, and why this discussion is so relevant to elected officials right now as well. So when I was active in the city, I actually, the mayor before me launched something called the Mayor's Climate Protection Initiative. When the federal government wasn't acting, local governments were going to take the lead on trying to reduce emissions to meet the targets of the Kyoto Protocol. Mayor Nichols set a goal of getting 141 other cities to sign on, the same number that signed the Kyoto Protocol. Ultimately, over 1,000 signed on. And I was one of the people tagged to help develop the climate action plan on that, to address how would we reduce emissions in the city of Seattle. And I think there's been a lot of leadership from cities, and I'm sure a lot of the people listening to this can point to examples in their localities, whether it's building efficiency, transit, walking or biking, reduction of emissions from city operations. There's a ton of different ways to reduce emissions. A lot of that innovation has been occurring at the local level as kind of the international and federal frameworks have failed to get where they need to go. So that's the background that then led me to the point where I was, as mayor, we were looking at updating our own climate action plan. What would that plan look like? And during that same period, I would say this is where the climate movement was taking a very significant shift. And it was spurred in part by a really influential article written by Bill McKibben in Rolling Stone magazine called Do the Math. I'm sure many of the folks listening have read it. If you haven't, you ought to. And the basic point of Do the Math was that when you looked at what the scientists were telling us about where temperatures would go and with CO2 emissions, Bill did the math. And the basic realization was that if you wanted to keep global temperatures at 2 degrees Fahrenheit, Celsius or lower, a target that might even be too much raise in temperature for us. But if you wanted to keep it at that level, about 80% of the known fossil fuel reserves would have to remain in the ground. It couldn't be burned. And that led to, Bill McKibben actually was coming to Seattle to launch a Do the Math tour across the entire nation at that time. And we invited him in to speak to our climate action panel that was looking at how do we improve our plan. And he laid this all out in front of us and then told us about where he was going next, which was not merely to focus on emissions and how do we change behavior and how do we change practices, but there actually needed to be a movement to keep fossil fuels in the ground. So that, I think, is a very, very dramatic shift. And the tactic he was proposing to us at the time was that universities should begin to divest from fossil fuels, basically as a moral statement that universities should not be investing in activities that would lead to these massive negative effects on humanity, the people that live on the planet. And that stuck with me. And in fact, that night when I introduced Bill McKibben at Benaroya Hall, and that's the slide you see right there, I said that the city of Seattle would see what we could do. And we later committed to begin the process of divesting from fossil fuels. By the way, Benaroya Hall was packed. Now, granted, Seattle's a very liberal place, but they had to get a new venue because there were so many people who were eager to listen to Bill and engage in this kickoff. The divestment movement has just exploded. We have seen the number of universities, the number of philanthropies, the number of individuals, as well as municipalities signing on. It's really struck a chord with people as being a very simple, I think it struck a chord because it's a very simple and straightforward way for institutions and individuals to identify where they stand on this issue. And again, I say it's essentially a moral statement of where they stand on the issue. And you see people organizing everywhere to do it. And the other comment I'll make, and we might get this back at the Q&A later, unlike the controversy that I faced as mayor on things like putting in biking lanes or you know, the difficulty of getting in transit lines, if you have to take away parking for a bus line or something like that, the public response to this was amazing as well. No negativity was expressed within the city of Seattle whatsoever around this. There are concerns expressed about it. You know, is it prudent to do financially? What's the best way to proceed? Is it the most effective tactic? Very little negative response to you're doing the wrong thing by making this choice. And trust me, as an elected official, when people were upset, I heard about it. I just didn't hear about it on this one at all. It's more bureaucratic inertia that seems to prevent movement on it than public opposition. This is apparently the fastest growing divestment movement in history as well. And I think the next place I want to go to talk about this is it wasn't, there's a symbolic element to this, obviously, about saying what side you were on. But when you looked at it, you realized that there was also a very prudent financial reason for moving ahead. And I'm going to leave it to our next speaker to kind of dig into the details of that a little bit more. But once you realize that 20% of you can only burn 20% of the fossil fuels, and that 80% have to remain in the ground, you are looking at a situation where if the world comes to its senses and actually takes the actions that are designed to protect us from the worst effects of climate change, this is going to have a dramatic effect on the profitability of companies that own fossil fuel reserves. Most of their stock price is tied up in the fact that they have a plan to, dig it up, sell it, for it to be burnt and emitted into the atmosphere. So institutions are then putting themselves at a very significant financial risk if indeed that's where the world goes. And I think if if you're following this in the news, it's just going faster and faster on in this regard. With the actions recently by the Pope, Norway's sovereign fund recently chose to divest. There's been a collapse in coal prices. So you see all of these factors now coming to a head. So I believe that the divestment movement is moving from a place of primarily making a statement to one where it's a prudent financial action by institutions to protect themselves from the risk of holding onto fossil fuels at a time when the world is moving away from them. So with that, I'm going to stop and move it on to our next speaker. I'm going to see if I've set a good example. I'm 3 minutes behind schedule now, so I'll count on our next speakers to catch us up. Tom Sanzillo is going to talk about, look at the financial impacts of fossil fuel investment. He has 30 years of experience in public and private finance. He was the first deputy controller of New York State, where he had oversight over a $156 billion pension fund, $200 billion in municipal bond programs, and he's currently the director of finance for the Institute of Energy and Economics and Financial Analysis. So, Tom, the floor is yours.
Good afternoon, morning. I don't know where everybody is, but hi. And thanks for attending this. My organization, Institute for Energy Economics and Financial Analysis, started out a number of years ago, and basically what we do is provide financial analysis and energy analysis for mostly non-profit organizations who are engaged in one way or another in looking for alternatives to fossil fuels. We do a lot of work on the coal issue, and we are largely based in the United States, but we also have an office in Sydney and one in Mumbai, and it looks like we're going to be opening up in Japan and Europe. So our outlook is increasingly global, and we publish globally on markets as well as very heavily in the United States. I'm not an elected official, never been an elected official, but worked for them and been around campaigns a little bit in my life. But I deal with money, and I'll just start out with one thing. Yesterday, Peabody Energy, which I think used to be the largest coal producer in the world, sold a mine in Australia. It's called the Wilkie Creek Mine. They sold it for what looks like, and it's not been consummated yet. These days, you never know. They say they're selling it for $75 million. 3 years ago, they were in talks with South Korean business people for $750 million. That's called 90% less. That's about the status of the coal markets these days. Can we go to the next slide? Is that how I should do this, by asking? Yes? Okay, thank you. So anyway, the main points I just want to go through, and to echo what we just heard, with sort of a friendly amendment. This is happening increasingly fast. In fact, I would say this is not a future risk. This is now. And I want to go through just recently what we did in Norway, which is the world's largest fund that divested from coal, and then talk to you a little bit about what the case for coal divestment is, what the case for oil and gas divestment is, and kind of how we're looking at the future. Next slide, please. The key to what happened in Norway, they recently divested from coal, not from oil and gas. And in Norway, and this is very important for any elected official anywhere in the world, the Norwegian legislature is the fiduciary. They decide on what to do. And while they had money managers and they have very intelligent professional staff telling them they should not have divested, they had another view, and they took a look at the environmental consequences of coal. They took a look at the climate consequences of coal, and they took a look at the finance consequences of coal, which I'll go to in a minute, and with coal losing enormous amounts of money for their portfolio. And they looked at the growing public opposition, and they made an all things considered judgment. And I would say to anyone on here who is an elected official or works for an elected official that that is your job, our job, that in the face of this kind of an issue, which cuts across everything, it cuts across finance and climate and environment, it cuts across law, it cuts across party, it cuts across race, it cuts across everything, it cuts across geography, and it requires our elected officials and hopefully some of our business leaders to take that all things considered judgment. We will not get this judgment from the financial community. You will not get this from professional money managers. If you ask them their opinion, they will tell you do not divest, period, even though they're losing money. So we add the financial dimension to this, and basically here's what. Next slide. So this little chart shows, it's called the Stowe Coal Index. It's a global index of coal companies. The 3 lines on the top show you basically where the world economy is going. It's sort of going up, but it ain't so great, but it's doing good. And the line on the bottom shows you where the coal industry has been going for the last 3 years. Now that's unprecedented. The coal industry usually goes up and down with the world economy. And so it tells us a couple of things. One, that the coal industry worldwide has lost 70% of value, while the world economy has gone up by about that, more or less, depending on which index you're looking at. That also tells us, so there's a lot of stock losses, a lot of stock drops, heavy ones from the one that I just mentioned to you. Peabody was trading, I think it peaked at 60 a number of years ago. It was $1.38 yesterday. So that's just enormous amounts of stock value lost for portfolios. Any university portfolio that holds them, or any coal stock, they're all doing the same. But it also means something else. And for all of you on the in this, I often only talk to investment people about this. But for this audience, this means that our economy can move upward and grow without this particular fossil fuel. That's what this is beginning to mean. It's not like 1 or 2 years. This is now 3 years. And next slide. And for the foreseeable future, through October 21st, this is what you will see if you're looking at the future price of coal, which is Newcastle. That's kind of a global benchmark for those of you not familiar. And the price of coal will be under $60 a ton. What is required for a robust market is $90 to $100 a ton. So while we've seen losses for the last 3 to 4 years, you will see losses for the next 6 years going forward. That's unprecedented. Next slide. So this particular headline is typical of what you would see in the investment world today, which is advice that an investment analyst would give. Run screaming from the coal stock's bloodbath. Don't be dragged into the value trap that is coal stock these days. That is the best advice almost anybody who's looking at the stock market today could give you regarding coal. But you will find that money managers and professional staff at major funds will not give this advice to the fiduciaries. They will mumble, they will tell you this, they probably won't even admit that there are errors. Now, I've done these conversations at lots of places, and it's a real shame that they're just not admitting that this is a big problem, and these places are going bankrupt. In the United States, we've had 30 coal bankruptcies in the last couple of years, and so it is a bad situation. It's probably going to get worse before it gets better. It's global. It's not just the U.S., although the U.S. is in the worst shape from a financial perspective. And that's, if I was to say the reason, you know the climate reasons, you know the environment reasons. This is, to me, a fairly significant reason why a fund should get out of coal. Next slide, please. Oil and gas is a little different. Oil and gas still is producing profits, but there is significant slippage. And what I mean by that is when I was investing money, we always looked to the oil industry as a market leader. They would be driving profits at the 15, 20% level pretty regularly, and they were dependent upon by most funds to do that. They typically are still a big portion of most funds, unlike coal, which is a very minor portion of the funds. Another reason to divest, they're not that important to the funds in the first place. But the oil and gas industry has taken 2 major initiatives, large capital bets. And when they do capital bets, these are bets into the future decades, right? So the 2 of them are oil shale or fracking and tar sands up in Canada. Neither of those initiatives are strong economic performers. They may be, with oil shale, there's strong production, there's a lot of movement, it's a major market mover, but in terms of investment, it's having terrible underperforming problems, and tar sands are having underperforming problems, and they're pulling back capital out of it. It's a complicated picture with oil shale, but the major growth storyline of oil and gas, which is what they've always been about, is being faced by a current low price environment and whether or not they can have a big comeback. So you have a kind of a different picture. Next slide, please. And just as I showed you before, this is the oil and gas industry writ large against the Dow Jones. So the green line shows you, and basically you can see that the, and actually this is also Exxon because the Vanguard is so heavily involved in Exxon. So you see the blue lines, that's where oil and gas is driving the markets. They're higher than the Dow Jones. So they're raising the Dow Jones up. But you can see of late, in the last 2 years, due to the low price in oil and the other things I was just talking about, you're seeing the separation, and now you're beginning to see a sharper separation. So it's lagging the market. Does that stay? I'd be more than willing to entertain some questions and discussion, but it's a factor right now, and it's historically, you know, unprecedented. This chart goes back to 2006, so at least in the last decade, and if you went back 30 years, you'd see it even more. Next slide. This is a short illustration. This is Chesapeake, which is a major fracker. They themselves are having the same problems. Some of the other fracking companies are doing a little better. Some are doing worse. None of them are doing gangbusters against the Dow Jones. Again, it's showing a certain weakness, even with all of the production and even with what you would see as a success on the natural gas market share increases in the United States. Next slide, please. This is the leading tar sands producer in Canada. They have a major capital bets in Canada. They themselves are having trouble. Complicated system of expensive mining. Tar sands is a very expensive process. Long-term capital, we're seeing the decline in price. Worldwide prices causing some pullback, and also complications within Canada. Public opposition movements are having a big effect on it, so you're seeing them underneath the Dow Jones average rather than leading it. Another cause of concern for a pension fund or an investment or an investor. Next slide. So the future price of oil, just as I did before, they with coal, they need about $100 a barrel, and they would like to, you know, keep that going for a long period of time. What we're looking at through 2022 is in the 70s and the 60s, depending on what you're doing, which is not robust. It's probably profitable, not like coal. Those numbers I showed you were not profitable for coal. So there's some profit to be made here still, which is why there is an argument to be careful on any kind of divestment out of oil and gas. Next slide. So when we talked before about the issue of the carbon bubble and the fact that there are big investments now in oil and gas that they're not making profits on, those stranded assets in the coal industry are now. Those stranded assets in the tar sands industry are also now. On the fracking side, it's a more complicated system, but they're lacking. These are not future issues. These are now. The New York State bill, which Senator Hoylman will talk about in a bit, hi, we haven't seen each other in a long time, is a bill that acts now, and it's appropriate. And it protects its fund from more losses. I've been very disappointed in the Comptroller of New York State's response on the coal issue, because he's lost hundreds of millions already and done nothing about it. The bill is also good because it requires a major fund to consider itself as a fossil-free portfolio, and I'll do a little bit more if you have questions on that as well, how you could arrange to structure those things. I think that's it for me.
Hey, thank you, Tom. That was great, and we're actually still awfully close. So I'm now going to introduce Senator Hoylman to talk about what's happening right now in New York State. He's a Democratic senator for New York State Senate in Manhattan's 27th district, first elected in the 2012 state election following 20 years as a grassroots activist. There's a theme here on this panel. He's also a Rhodes Scholar. Okay, that's where the theme breaks down. I was not a Rhodes Scholar. And has a long history of working on civic issues, including affordable housing, public transportation, LGBT rights, and campaign finance reform. Senator, the floor is yours.
Hey, thank you so much, Mike, and thanks everyone. And it's great to hear from my old colleague, Tom Sanzillo. We used to work together about a decade ago. Thanks for your expertise on this issue, which is so important. You know, I just wanted to give a brief context as to where we are in state climate actions in New York, and then talk about the bill that Tom Sanzillo mentioned that would require divestment from fossil fuels by the state's pension fund. You know, I'm the chair of the Environmental Conservation Committee, I hope, after 2016. At the moment, I'm the ranking member. And so I and a bunch of my other colleagues in the Senate answer to Republican leadership. And that creates some obstacles for us along the way. There's really, in the Senate, in my humble opinion, an anti-science undercurrent. The Senate Republicans, to take one small example, rejected something as seemingly innocuous as a resolution on Earth Day that I submitted that had included a call to action for fighting climate change. Instead, they replaced it with their own kind of toothless resolution that didn't mention the words climate change at all and basically talked about recycling throughout the entire resolution. I mention it because it's kind of a snapshot as to where the Republicans are. During a discussion on that issue, the chair of the State Senate Finance Committee said that he intentionally omitted climate change from the resolution because he frankly didn't necessarily believe in it. He pointed to recent cold winters in Syracuse as evidence that climate change wasn't real. And the new Senate Majority Leader, John Flanagan, actually told reporters shortly after he was elevated to his new post that when asked about climate change and Senator DeFrancisco's remarks, he said he had to consult with his members. And he also cited cold winters on Long Island. So that's kind of the backdrop. There's like a stark kind of symphony of disbelief among my Republican colleagues. But I wanted to move, though, briefly to the state divestment actions. I co-sponsor the bill that was mentioned. It's called the Fossil Fuel Divestment Act. It's carried by Senator Liz Krueger, who couldn't be here today but sends her regards, and in the Assembly is carried by Assemblymember Felix Ortiz. It was introduced this June. And the bill would require the state controller to divest the Common Retirement Fund from all fossil fuel holdings by 2020. Now, the pension fund, you know, is one of the largest and most visible institutional investors in the world. It's the third largest pension fund in the U.S. I think the assets are close to $180 billion, and they invest at least $5 billion of public pension money in companies that mine and drill and produce fossil fuels. So $5 billion invested in fossil fuels. So utilizing a best practice, the bill would aim to divest from the top 200 largest publicly traded companies as defined by carbon content in the company's proven oil, gas, and coal reserves. And the list features the top 100 coal companies and top 100 oil and gas companies on the planet, including companies like BP, ExxonMobil, and Chevron. And divestment from coal companies, according to legislation, must be completed within a year of the bill's passage, and divestment from all other fossil fuel companies completed by January 1st, 2020. Now, there's an issue of fiduciary responsibility and what the controller is responsible for, and I'd love to hear Tom's thoughts on that. But the bill contains something called akin to a safety valve, and it would permit the controller to cease divestment or reinvest in previously divested companies if he can convincingly demonstrate that the retirement fund has lost significant value as a direct result of any of that fossil fuel divestment. I would say that such a loss of value is unlikely, as we heard from Tom, as continuing studies are showing that the fossil-free funds can perform as well or better. And finally, the bill includes a requirement that the controller identify all companies subject to divestment in which the pension fund has holdings and report annually on progress of divestment from those companies. And just a final note about the importance of divestment. And again, the size of the pension fund, the enormity of the message that it would send, and the moral component that I think we as public officials need to heed, which is we should not be investing in stocks that are creating the destruction of our planet. It's as simple as that. There are certainly other examples of this type of divestment. We've seen it with cigarette companies in South Africa during apartheid. I myself asked the controller to divest from Russian holdings during the Sochi Olympics and after anti-LGBT legislation was passed. And I want to say that even if we don't have success in the coming year with the Republican Senate possibly blocking this legislation, I do think that we're creating an opportunity to have a discussion with the New York State Controller and his team, which includes Pete Granis as a deputy controller and one of the founders of Earth Day. I think Mr. Granis gets it, and I think this legislation is going to create a framework for a discussion that we all want to see that in the end, the divestment of all fossil fuels. Thanks so much.
Thank you, Senator. So next up is Svante Murek, and he's going to talk about Ithaca's work on divestment and climate change. In 2012, Svante became Ithaca's youngest mayor at age 24 and its first African-American mayor, having previously been elected as an alder at age 20 while still a student at Cornell. I'm just surrounded by prodigies on this panels. He's one of the first mayors to commit publicly to divestment. So welcome, Svante. And we're running a few minutes behind here, but I think we're close to on time.
Oh, sure. Can you hear me okay?
Yes.
Okay. Well, then I'll, if we're running behind, this is obviously, I'm preaching to the choir here a bit, but I'll tell you a bit about Ithaca that we've been committed over the last, I'm now in my 4th year of my term, my 8th year in office overall, and here in Ithaca we focused on reducing our reliance on fossil fuels, both on the administrative level for our government operations and on the community level. So in the community, we have one of the best in the world car share programs, a transit program that's consistently ranked in the top 5 in the country. And in fact, in Ithaca, we have more people who walk to work than anywhere else in the country. Our percentage of people who walk to work is 15%. The next closest city is New York City, where only 9% of people walk to work. So once again, New York is trying to keep up with us. On the governmental side, we've done a lot of things, including energy audits on our buildings. We're installing solar panels as we speak that are going to allow us to provide 1/3 of our energy from solar. That's for our government operations. We've pooled our own vehicles to do sort of a car share for city employees. But specifically on divestment, shortly after I took office, I signed an executive order. And here at the municipal level, it's that easy. You can sign an executive order. I didn't even need legislative approval to do it. And we divested from fossil fuels. Look, when compared with the comptroller's fund, not a big deal, right? I mean, our entire budget is about $70 million a year. I'm not sure that would even catch the attention of the comptroller, much less the fossil fuel industry. But I think for the same reason it's important for the comptroller to divest, it was important for us to divest. And I sent a big letter to Comptroller DiNapoli, who called me, and we had a good discussion about it after we divested. And it is this issue which the senator just mentioned of moral authority and being able to set an example. Shortly after I took office, I took my parking space. I have a parking space outside City Hall, and it's dedicated to me. It's a reserved for mayor. This thing it's the best spot in town, right? It's right in front of City Hall. You don't have to pay, which is wonderful. But I sold my car, right? So I walk. I use car share. I take the bus. I ride my bike. So I took the parking space. I took a couple of park benches, and we took a couple potted plants, put them there, and it is now the smallest park in the city of Ithaca. And this thing, it's a small thing. I'd be the first to admit, it's kind of a silly thing, but it's symbol, and those symbols matter. And divesting was a symbol in the same sense. There's this old story of a woman who brought her son to meet Gandhi, and she wanted him to meet Gandhi because she needed her son to stop eating so much sugar. He was eating a lot of candy and a lot of sugar, and he wouldn't listen to her, but he idolized Gandhi. So they took a day-long trip in India. They took a day-long trip to go and see him. And she said to him, Gandhi, will you tell my son to stop eating so much candy? And Gandhi looked at the boy and said, I'm sorry, but I can't do that. If you come back in a month, I'll see what I can do. So the woman's annoyed, but it's Gandhi, right? So she walks away, and they take the day-long trip back, and in a month they take the day-long trip to see Gandhi again. But when they get there, she says, do you remember me? And she says, of course I remember you exactly. He gets down on one knee, looks the young man in the face, and says, son, you need to stop eating so much sugar and so much candy. And the woman's like, well, why couldn't you do that a month ago if that was so hard? And he said, well, I would have loved to, but a month ago I was eating too much candy. And that's the power of moral authority, of being able to say, it's not just that you, the private sector, and you, average citizens, should invest in the future of our planet. You should make sacrifices and forego the largest short-term profit in order to build a more sustainable economy. Being able to walk the talk, being able to be the first ones through the door to say, look, we believe in this so much, we did it first. I think that's why it's important, and that's why we did it in Ithaca.
Thank you, Mayor. I was wondering when I was on the panel with you if you were the mayor I had read about who did that, who did the office and the parking lot. Yeah. And I have to say that that was an awesome piece about you, and you've really shown tremendous leadership. So thank you. Thank you for what you had to say here.
I appreciate it. And I'll tell you that we've done a lot of things in Ithaca over 4 years. We've made tremendous strides. But if you came to Ithaca today and asked about me, they'd be like, oh, yeah, the parking space guy. That was pretty cool.
Yeah, I was the biking guy. I recommend the parking space to any other politicians in the office. So I'm going to turn it over to Satya next to talk about for just a quick overview of resources. Then I'll do a close, and then we'll be able to take Q&A from the folks on the call. Thank you all for hanging in there with us. Satya.
Great. Thanks, Mayor. And thanks to all of the speakers. That's really interesting information and presentation. So I just want to quickly tell you about some of the resources that the Mayor's Innovation Project has for local elected officials and staff around fossil fuel divestment. But let me say also that we have resources on a number of issues related to climate sustainability and the environment. So if you want to look at our website, which is mayorsinnovation.org, you'll find a whole range of things. But specifically on divestment, we have a brief, which you see an image of here, relatively short, that sort of outlines the arguments, many of which you've heard today, but also a set of actions that local governments can take around divestment. We also have model resolutions for cities and counties that you can pass. I suppose other units of government as well, school boards could use them. And we keep a running list of local units of government that have made some sort of commitment to divestment. And we'd be happy to connect you with those folks around the country that are working on this, certainly other local leaders, but other folks that are working at the state level and on campuses as well. We can offer some technical assistance on this subject, and my colleague James Irwin is the contact there. So if you are considering making a divestment commitment, James would be happy to talk you through that or help you figure out the best way to move forward on it. We can provide some expertise and information and or connect you with folks around the country that can provide that. And we can also talk broadly about reinvestment options, which is, I think, a direction that the movement is going in, to not only think about divesting from fossil fuels, but reinvesting in a clean energy economy. And we have information about that. I think, so again, and you'll see at the end our contact information, but it's mayorsinnovation.org. And Dominic, I think you're going to talk a little bit about ICLEI.
Yes, thank you, Satya. So one of our partners, and thank you for all the speakers for the wonderful presentation. And it's good to know, Savante, that you're still having fun sitting on the park bench up front, and hoping folks are giving you some good feedback there. You can also, by the way, you can text Mayor Myrick and have it show up in his office on a little scrolling text thing. So yet another innovation. To clean energy resources. So yes, if we're transitioning away from fossil fuels, we need to transition to something, and that is to clean energy. ICLEI, which was founded over 20 years ago, also by local governments in North America and expanded around the world, is one of the go-to resources for local governments interested in taking leadership on climate change. So many climate communities, as you know, use ICLEI for climate action plans and for passing policies on ranging from transportation and walkable communities to smart planning to procurement issues for procurement for local or clean energy. And these resources are available here at this link, and they are very happy to answer any questions from any local government officials.
Okay, well, I'm going to try to give a little wrap up here, and then we can open it up for questions. And, you know, when I started the discussion, I was talking about how the climate movement had taken a change from looking at behavior and operations and kind of the supplies, you know, how we behave and how we need to reduce our own fossil fuel emissions. And now we saw the growth of the Keep It in the Ground movement. And the first point I want to make is it's not that one replaces the other. We still have to be extraordinarily diligent about our use of fossil fuels and creating places where we don't need as much. I also spoke a little bit, and we also heard from Tom on this point, about the risk of for these fossil fuels. And I want to amplify what the risk is there of staying invested in fossil fuels. One was the risk of regulatory action, which I mentioned. But there's also just the risk of alternative sources of supply that outcompete them. You know, to put it in a nutshell, to obtain oil and natural gas requires more and more expensive investments to get it. So bringing back fossil fuels from shale oil, you know, from tar sands, from the Arctic, it's just not profitable at current prices. But the industry is still making a bet that it will be. And our own experience here in Seattle was that about 3 or 4 years ago, we saw the coal industry putting a huge full court press on localities to build coal export facilities. Because the market for coal was falling apart, they wanted governments to put money in to help them export it to China where there were new markets. All of that's falling apart now because the market has dropped out of coal. And in part, that's because it's cheaper and easier to provide energy by other means than coal. And I think we're going to start seeing that occur too as solar and wind becomes much more effective. Elon Musk's new storage facilities, you know, a home battery to store local production of solar. There's a marketplace thing that's going to happen here too. And I am from the East Coast, and I think all of us can look at cities back east that once had thriving industries. I spent a lot of time near Westfield, Massachusetts, which was the whip city. They were the leading manufacturer of buggy whips in the country. And things can move and move really fast. And I think that's partly what we're seeing here as well. So there's the moral call to action, which you hear. There's also the fiscal reasons to move as well. One of the objections you're going to hear is you just can't do this right away. It's too risky, too premature. And one of the important points to remember is that the divestment process is meant to be orderly and thoughtful. That you're going to identify your investments, work with managers about what your holdings are, and then take 5 years to get out of them. As Tom pointed out, there's probably reasons to get out of them faster. And then there's ways to use that pension fund to make smarter, wiser investments in where you are. I think the final point to make here is, Satya used the term movement, I've used the term movement. That's what I think we're seeing here. And that movement has really practical implications. I was just talking about the economics of it, but the movement was started around divestment because of the difficulty of fighting the oil companies who make the argument of jobs or the economy or the like, and use their power in legislatures and with regulatory agencies. And I think if you look at this, you can see, I'll make the point, and you can agree or disagree, that oil companies are heading down the path of tobacco companies. At one point, tobacco companies were viewed as, an important part of our economy. And slowly they lost their social license to operate because public opinion turned against them. And we are right at that turning point right now, and that is in large part what the divestment movement is about. And in fact, smoking rates in this country have gone down dramatically, and it was that removal of the social license from tobacco companies that enabled a much tougher regulatory arena and meant that people, started making more choices not to use tobacco. And again, the drop in tobacco use has been dramatic. I think we saw something similar with drunk driving as well. It's not where it should be, but a lot better than it used to be as well. So this is the pathway that oil and natural gas companies are going to. And I don't know if you saw this, but emails just came out that Exxon basically understood climate change 27 years ago and then worked to suppress and hide it. And I mention that because of the parallels to the tobacco companies. And the fact that there are articles being written this way are really dramatic. One of the things you'll find, though, when you talk about this is that people, have a concern because they drive, they fly, they heat their homes a certain way, they know jobs are created. And we do have to acknowledge that, as a society, we lived on the benefits of having cheap fossil fuels. We all benefited from that. And so we can't demonize individuals or ourselves for doing that, but we know better now. And that's all we're asking to do, is to recognize what we now know and make a change, because we have the capacity to do that. We've done it before, and we can do it again. So with that, I'll stop, and we'll open it up for Q&A from the audience.
Thank you, Michael. So folks, if you'd like to ask questions, you can raise your hand and I'll come through and unmute you. You can also submit them electronically, but as we're getting started, I wanted to give our panelists a chance to ask each other questions or add additional comments if anything had come up during the presentations.
This is Senator Hoylman. I have a question for Tom Sanzillo.
Go right ahead,
Tom,
please.
what do you think about the constitutional perspective of the legislature requiring the state controller to divest, given that the controller is the sole trustee of the fund?
Good question. So this is a particularly quirky thing for New York State, but it is germane to any public pension system because you've resolved this question in one way or another, and it's an important question. In New York State, and I've had to argue sort of the other side of this, where executive encroachment on pension funds, usually the raid of money for budgetary purposes, and this is not that. But here's how I would approach this one. The legislature, actually, in a couple of the cases, I said this to Senator Krueger, the legislature has a co-fiduciary responsibility when it comes to protecting the benefits of the fund. And when it comes to coal, I would argue that that investment is so profoundly wrong and losing money that it jeopardizes the benefits of the system. And therefore, the legislature has every right to challenge the controller and tell them to get out of it. On oil and gas, I think you've done the appropriate thing with regard to the thing you called the safety valve, because really what we want, and we want them to divest, but really what you need, and correctly the legislation does, is to tell them to tell your money managers, you, fiduciary, tell your money managers to come up with a way in which our fund can be fossil-free and we still meet our financial benchmarks. Now, that'll take a little bit of work when it comes to oil and gas, at least as we see now. But if they put their minds to it, they will find a way to do that. Now, with coal, it's very easy not to lose 90% of value, so they should be able to find something. I think anybody on his phone can do that. But for the oil and gas, you want to do a little study, you want to do it. But the most important thing, and the reason I say it is most important, is that it isn't just your controller telling the money manager for the New York Common Retirement Fund that we want to see how our fund would look without fossil fuels. And then you basically say the controller needs to design a plan based on that, and that's right, that's what you do. So I don't think you violate the Constitution. But from my point of view, the people who you're telling to design a fossil-free portfolio run the pension systems all over the world. This is the second, as you said, it's the second largest fund in the United States. They are dead set against doing this, and if we can start compelling them because the fiduciaries tell them to do so, we're going to start a discussion amongst the investment professionals all over the world as to how this is possible. So your legislation has not only constitutional, I think, it has profound implications for not only New York State, but for all the major funds, at least in the United States, and probably all over the world.
Great question.
We are, this is Mike McGinn, we're also seeing a, huge amount of money already looking for alternative investments. So the market may not be there yet, but it's going to get there. And one other comment I thought of, you will often hear from the investment professionals that you can't do anything to reduce risk by reducing the diversification of your portfolio. But I think the counter to that is this is what investment professionals do, is make choices between investments. So that's what they need to do here too, is make choices moving forward. It's not such a large part of the marketplace that they're not going to have a wealth of other opportunities to invest, but the market does have to move to provide more opportunities to make it easy to divest.
So we're at the hour mark. We have a couple of questions from the audience, and we still have everybody on the line, which is fantastic. Presenters, do you have a few extra minutes to hang out and discuss a little more about this? Or
Yes.
Yes, just a few. Yes.
Okay, wonderful. Let's continue on for another minute or so. And folks on the line, if you'd like to raise your hand, please do so, and I'll come through and unmute you so you can interact directly with our presenters. We have a question from Carol Chalk, who's asking, for those of us whose funds are not directly invested in the market, but rather invested via bank accounts, is there a mechanism to request divestment of those funds?
I'm not quite sure about what that means, but at any entity that you have your money in has money managers, and if it's your personal money, you are the fiduciary. And while you may not be big enough to command them to do so, you can make the request of them, see if you ever get a thoughtful kind of response, and then make your decisions accordingly. But I think, and this is something that the mayor said also. He said, "Oh, we're small and all of that kind of things." Nobody's too small for this one, because our systems, our governmental systems and our international systems have abdicated responsibility. So in a sense, we're all responsible. I know it's unfair. I know it's not right that somebody every individual has to on the monumental task of global climate change. It's not right. It's not fair. And that's what the world's made up of. That's how change gets made.
So one more question. This is from Benjamin Cohen, and I think this one could be the topic of many other webinars. Let's throw it out there. Aside from divesting money in fossil fuel interests within an institution or a state's portfolio, what are the concrete actions that will decarbonize the electric, transportation, and building sectors?
Could you repeat the last part of that again?
What are the concrete actions that will decarbonize electric, transportation, and building sectors?
This is Dominic. I wanted to jump in really quickly with one specific opportunity in Tompkins County, and I'm on the board of directors for the Black Oak Wind Farm, which is the first community-owned wind farm in New York State. And this is pooled by funds from individuals like you and me, who are interested in transitioning our grid to clean energy sources. 7-turbine industrial turbine project, relatively small comparison to the big ones, but it's a model for how communities can actually be producing their own energy in a way that benefits local communities. And there are examples all around the state and around the world of that in solar and geothermal and many other energy sources as well. And I think that kind of community energy production is a big part of
it. I think I would answer it in two quick ways. Go ahead, Mike. Mike, are you going to do something?
Jump in there, Tom.
Yeah, okay. I'll answer from a financial and a little more political than I normally am. Is that the fossil fuel sector, and I do a lot of advocacy, both oil and gas and coal in this instance, works to do two things. Get more from the government than they possibly can, and in the instance of coal, these are just bailouts at this point for an industry that has no economic rationale, and oil and gas just keeps looking for their subsidies, which are ubiquitous throughout the entire system of government. I would say wherever we find them, get rid of them, and allow the competitors to compete on a equal playing field, which to me means where there are provisions providing governmental support and incentives to provide them for wind and solar and energy efficiency, since for the last 35 years they've been starved. And that's what I would do.
The only comment I make was that carbon and fossil fuel use is so deeply embedded in our systems, both the energy sector and the transportation sector, that there's so many different ways to go at it, and all of them are required to get to the reductions that are needed. So we'd be happy to connect offline if somebody wanted to examine that more fully. But I think it's a combination of local action, federal action, international action, and all of that requires kind of the political will to look at how we do things, which is why that divestment movement is so important.
And there are examples of countries that have done this successfully. Costa Rica earlier this year had, I believe, for 75 days straight, I spent a lot of time in Freiburg, Germany. Germany last year hit 3 days in a row where 50% of the nation's power was from renewable sources. And that was an achievement made from all the reasons that just said, a combination of local action, federal policy, and a strong interest from the public, it really shows that what exists is possible.
And that sounds like a perfect note to start wrapping things up on. Dominic, do you have some suggestions for those who might be interested in pursuing this beyond this call?
Yes, thank you, James. So there was some conversation, some of the elected officials involved with elected officials to Protect New York about how could local electeds in New York, which have really set in many issues a leadership role throughout the country, is there a way that we could join together on this issue? So if anyone would be interested in helping draft a letter, a statement from New York State local elected officials on divestment to the comptroller, to go on record requesting that the comptroller studies and pursues the divestment, or to support the state legislation that has previously been talked about by the senator, please email me at Dominic, D-O-M-I-N-I-C, at nyelectedofficials.org. That's Dominic at nyelectedofficials.org. And our folks at Elected Officials to Protect New York will get back to you and with some potential talking points to get you started, and take it from there.
Perfect. Thank you. Satya, do you want to wrap things up?
Thanks, James. Yeah, so not much else to say, but again, I'd invite any elected officials on the call or city staff to check out the Mayor's Innovation Project. Our August meeting is the 13th through 15th in Des Moines, Iowa, and we do have a number of resources on our website, which is mayorsinnovation.org. On divestment in particular, I direct you to James. You can see his contact information here on the screen. And then finally, I just want to thank all of our presenters today, and special hello to Mayor Merrick. Nice to hear you on the phone, Mayor of my hometown, Ithaca. And thanks to everyone who's listening for your work in New York on sustainability issues, and encourage you to keep working on climate issues in particular. We think divestment's a great step forward, but certainly only one of many, and I appreciate all the work that you're doing. And we'll wrap it there. Thank you very much.
Thanks, everybody. Really appreciate it.